What kind of woman slaps her own daughter-in-law across the face, in front of 18 relatives, on Christmas night? And what does it mean when that same woman is sobbing into her napkin 12 months later, begging for the one thing she once threw away? If this story pulls at you even a little, hit subscribe now, tap that like button, and share this with someone who has ever kept the peace at their own expense. Trust me, you'll want to see how this one ends. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 35 years old. I work as a labor and delivery nurse, which means I've spent 13 years learning how to stay calm when everyone around me is falling apart. That skill came in handy the night my mother-in-law hit me across the face and told me to take my daughter and leave her house. But to understand why she did it, and why everything after that fell apart so completely, you need to understand the 4 years before it. My husband is Daniel Whitcomb. Steady, careful, the kind of man who irons his jeans and hates confrontation the way some people hate heights. We live in a small brick house on Hollow Creek Road with our daughter Maddie, who was 8 that Christmas. It's not a fancy house. The dishwasher rattles and the porch step needs replacing. But it's ours, paid for with my overnight shifts and Daniel's steady paycheck as a high school teacher. Daniel's mother, Patricia Whitcomb, lives 25 minutes away in a large brick colonial with white columns and a lawn that gets mowed in perfect diagonal stripes. Patricia has a way of saying certain phrases that tell you exactly where you stand in her world. "We don't do that in this family" is one of her favorites. She says it about raised voices, about wearing sneakers to church, about asking direct questions at dinner. For 4 years, I had a seat at Patricia's table, but it was never really my seat. It was a seat I paid for, 1 month at a time, and I didn't fully understand that until the night everything broke. Before I explain what happened at that Christmas dinner, you need to know where I come from, because Patricia never let me forget it, not once, not for 4 years. I grew up in Fenwick Trailer Court, in a single-wide home with thin walls and a space heater that never quite reached the back bedroom. My mother worked 2 cleaning jobs to keep us fed. I remember doing homework at a card table because we didn't own a real desk. I became a certified nursing assistant at 17, worked my way through nursing school on scholarships and double shifts. And the day I became a registered nurse, my mother cried because it was the first diploma anyone in our family had ever framed. I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because the very first time Patricia met me, she found this story within the first 10 minutes, and she never once let me forget where I came from. Daniel brought me to meet his family at a big dinner party, early in our relationship. Patricia looked me over, my shoes, my coat, the way I held my fork, and by the end of the night she took both my hands in hers and said, in front of everyone, "What a remarkable journey you've had, Nora." Not a compliment, a label, a story people tell to make themselves feel generous for including me. 4 years of marriage, and Patricia never introduced me to anyone without somehow working in where I came from. Sometimes it sounded like a compliment. It never was. It was a price tag she kept pinned to my sleeve so nobody mistook me for one of them. The strange thing is, I let her do it. Where I grew up, you learn early that belonging has a cost, and I had been raised by a woman who paid that cost her whole life without complaint. I just didn't understand yet how literal that cost was about to become in my own life. Christmas at Patricia's house was not a holiday. It was a performance. The good china came down from the cabinet, service for 20, hand-washed only. The seating never changed. Patricia at the head of the table. Her daughter, my sister-in-law Renee, at her right hand. Daniel at her left. And me, 4 years running, at the far end near whichever cousin had small children likely to spill something. That year, dinner started at 6. Somewhere between the main course and dessert, Renee stood up, tapped her wine glass, and made an announcement. She was opening a new boutique downtown. Her 3rd attempt at a business, though the first 2 hadn't lasted a year between them. This time, she said, would be different. And then she raised her glass toward her mother and said the sentence that changed everything. None of this would be possible without Mom, who believed in me enough to put up $15,000. The table applauded. I sat at the far end and did the math, the way 13 years of night shifts have trained me to do under pressure. $15,000, from a 63-year-old widow on a fixed pension, who, as far as anyone in that room knew, was simply comfortable. What nobody knew, what I had never told a single soul, was that Patricia's actual mortgage on that colonial house had been quietly paid out of my own checking account for 4 years. $850 a month, every month, since the winter my father-in-law passed away. Plus another $200 a month covering Renee's car insurance, because there had been a crisis once, and temporary had somehow become permanent. I had never told the cousins. I had never told anyone. That was the deal I made with my own pride, that you don't get to resent what you volunteer for. So I sat there while the whole family toasted Patricia's generosity that was actually funded, dollar for dollar, by the woman at the end of the table Patricia liked to call a remarkable journey. And I might have stayed quiet. I had 4 years of practice staying quiet. But Renee, flushed with wine and applause, looked straight down the table at me and smiled and said, "Some people just talk about supporting family. Some of us actually show up." She knew exactly whose money it was. That was the moment something in me finally stopped bending. I didn't raise my voice. I set my fork down, and into the warm silence after the toast, I said one calm, true sentence. "Before we celebrate Mom's generosity, you should probably know that boutique money and the car insurance comes from the same account that's been covering the mortgage on this house. Mine and Daniel's. For 4 years. I've never minded. But if we're doing gratitude tonight, let's at least get the credit right." The temperature in that room dropped below freezing. Renee's glass stopped halfway to the table. Daniel, sitting beside his mother, went very still and stared down at his plate. I watched him choose that plate over me, and it's a moment I would replay in therapy many times in the months that followed. Patricia rose from the head of the table with the unhurried certainty of a woman who has never once been contradicted in her own dining room. She walked the entire length of that table, past the china cabinet, past her own grandchildren, and slapped me across the face, hard enough to turn my head, in front of my 8-year-old daughter. "You will always be trailer trash," she said, each word pressed flat and even like she was ironing a shirt. "Take your daughter and get out of my house." 18 people, and the only sound in the room was the furnace kicking on. Maddie's fork was still in her hand. I looked at my husband one last time, giving him one full second to say something, anything. He looked at his plate instead. So I stood. I didn't argue. I buttoned my daughter's coat in the hallway under the framed family photos, carried our bags out to the car, and walked out the front door of a house I had been quietly paying for without a single word of protest. The drive home took 25 minutes. Maddie fell asleep before we even hit the highway. My hands stayed perfectly steady on the wheel because I was doing math again, and math has always been the thing that keeps me calm. My phone rang at 8:40 the next morning. It was Patricia, and she was crying. For about 4 seconds, standing at my kitchen counter with my coffee still steaming, some tired, hopeful part of me actually believed she was calling to apologize. 4 years of pretending, and I still believed the story might change. Then she spoke. "Nora, do you understand what you did last night? You tore this family apart on Christmas. Renee cried all night. The cousins won't stop calling me." I said nothing, and then, wet and almost casual, came the actual reason for her call. "Listen, the mortgage payment comes out on the 3rd. With everything so upset right now, I need to know that's not going to be affected. Please tell me you're not going to be childish about the house." Not an apology. Not a single question about whether Maddie was okay after watching her grandmother strike her mother. Just the mortgage, due on the 3rd. Something in my chest went perfectly, surgically quiet. The same stillness I feel when a monitor starts alarming, and the whole room panics, but my hands already know exactly what to do. "I'll text you," I said and hung up. I looked down at my coffee. It was still warm. That's how fast 4 years of hope can finish dying. It only takes one phone call, and the coffee doesn't even have time to go cold. If you've ever given everything to someone who only ever noticed what you could still give them, stay with me, because the next part is exactly for you. And if you believe love should never come with a bill attached, subscribe right now. It genuinely helps get this story in front of more people who need to hear it. Let me walk you through the real math behind that house, because every family has a number like this hiding under the surface, and nobody ever says it out loud. When my father-in-law died 4 years earlier, it came out quietly in a lawyer's office that the mortgage on that colonial was still very much alive, and his pension had mostly died with him. Patricia had a small widow's benefit and a great deal of pride. Daniel sat at our kitchen table one night doing math with a pencil, his face gray, and I did what I always do. I offered to help. $850 a month just until she got back on her feet. Temporary. Then Renee had her seasonal crisis. A lapsed insurance policy, $200 a month, also supposedly temporary. Nobody ever formally decided it would become permanent. That's simply how these arrangements work. Gratitude has a short memory, but automatic payments never forget. The 3rd of every month came, the money left my account, and nobody had to feel a single thing about it. 4 years, $1,250 a month, over $60,000 total, while I patched my old scrub tops and Patricia bought fresh place settings for that china cabinet. I tried, 3 separate times, to sit down and renegotiate that arrangement like an adult. Each time, something conveniently interrupted the conversation. A headache, the holidays approaching, a sudden crisis from Renee. You cannot schedule an honest conversation with people whose entire comfort depends on that conversation never actually happening. I understand that now. At the time, I just kept paying rent on a seat at a table where the landlady, it turned out, had been planning my eviction the whole time, free of charge. Here is exactly what I did the morning after Christmas, in full, because the family's version of this story eventually turned me into a villain plotting revenge in the shadows. I finished my coffee. I opened my banking app while Maddie watched cartoons in her pajamas. I found the 2 scheduled payments and canceled them, both of them, in under 2 minutes. Faster than it had taken Patricia to walk the length of her table to slap me the night before. Then I wrote one text message, revised it twice, not to sharpen it, but to soften the edges, and sent it to both Patricia and Renee, because I don't do things behind people's backs. After last night, the financial support ends. December's payment was the last one. This isn't punishment, and it isn't a negotiation. It's simply over. I wish you both well. Please don't call me about this. I didn't post anything online. I didn't tell a single cousin my side of the story. The only person I told directly was Daniel, when he came downstairs 10 minutes later already holding his phone like it was ticking, because his mother had called him before I'd even rinsed my coffee cup. Notice that order. It matters later. The first reply I actually received wasn't from Patricia at all. It came from Renee, 3 question marks followed by a long paragraph, ending with a line I still remember word for word. You just made the biggest mistake of your marriage. Not of my life, of my marriage. Even in a panic about her car insurance, Renee knew exactly where the pressure point sat and exactly who could be counted on to lean on it. Daniel and I had our own fight that night, after Maddie was finally asleep, in the fierce whispers of 2 people who have never learned how to argue at normal volume. I'll give him this much credit. He never once defended the slap. He'd been genuinely horrified, and he had texted his mother that very morning saying what she did was unforgivable. But when it came to the money, he stood by the refrigerator and said, I just don't think we should weaponize this. That's her house, Nora. She's 63. And I heard myself answer in a voice I barely recognized, low and level, the voice underneath 4 years of pleasant smiling. I'm not weaponizing anything. A weapon is something you swing at someone. I'm simply putting down something I was never supposed to be carrying alone in the first place. He said she'd lose the house. I told him that was possible, and that it wouldn't be my doing. That house had been quietly sinking for 4 years, and I had been the only thing holding it up, and you cannot call it a flood the moment the person holding the wall finally lets go and steps back. He said, she's my mother. And I said the thing I had circled around for 4 years and never quite landed on. I know, and I've been her second income and her favorite insult, both at the same time since Maddie was a baby. You've watched it happen at that table for years. And last night, you looked at your plate. He flinched like I'd struck him. He slept in the guest room that night. I lay awake doing the thing I do best at 3 a.m, watching the numbers, refusing to panic. And somewhere before dawn, I understood that the slap had only ended my arrangement with Patricia. My arrangement with Daniel, the one where I quietly carried things so he never had to choose between his mother and me, that one was only just beginning its review. In late January, something strange surfaced, and I want to tell you about it now, because everything at the end of this story circles back to it. Daniel had brought home a few boxes from his father's estate months earlier, things nobody had gotten around to sorting, fishing licenses, cufflinks, an old shoebox of photographs. It fell to me to go through it, because apparently I was still useful, even in exile. Inside that shoebox, tucked between a fishing trip photo and someone's christening picture, I found a black and white photograph of a small laundromat, a hand-painted sign reading suds and such. Standing out front was a teenage girl in an apron, arms crossed, chin lifted, staring at the camera the way you look at something you've decided to survive. It took me 10 full seconds, and then it took my breath away. The jawline, the eyes, it was Patricia. I flipped it over. Just a year written in pencil decades ago. When I showed Daniel, he did something I had never once seen him do in 4 years of marriage. He glanced toward the kitchen doorway first, as though his mother's hearing somehow reached across town before he answered quietly. My grandparents ran that laundromat. Mom worked there all through school. She never talks about it. Dad kept that photo, and she hated that he did. I stood there holding a picture of a girl in an apron who had my mother-in-law's exact face, and I felt the floor of 4 years tilt a few degrees under me. "You will always be trailer trash," she'd said, flat and even like she was ironing. I had assumed her cruelty came from somewhere above me, a woman born comfortable, looking down. It hadn't. It had come from somewhere much closer to the trailer court than to that colonial house, and somehow that made it both stranger and sadder. On the first warm Sunday in February, I did something I hadn't done in over a decade. I drove Maddie out to Fenwick Trailer Court. It's still there, smaller than I remembered, the way everything true tends to be. I parked across from the lot where I grew up, a different trailer sitting there now, with a pinwheel garden and somebody's bike tipped over in the grass. I told Maddie the truth, plainly, the way an 8-year-old deserves to hear it, about doing homework at a card table, about my mother leaving before sunrise in her good blouse to clean other people's houses. Maddie listened with her whole face, the way children do. Then she asked the question only a child would ask without flinching. "If you grew up in a trailer, why does Grandma Patricia hate trailers so much?" I looked at the pinwheels spinning in someone else's yard and thought about a girl in an apron outside a laundromat, and I gave my daughter the truest answer I had. "Some people spend their whole lives running from where they started, baby, and anyone who reminds them of it starts to feel like the road pulling them back." We sat there a while. Then I said the sentence I had driven all that way to say out loud, so it would count. "We are done paying rent for our seat at anyone's table, Maddie, both of us." She nodded, solemn as a judge, and asked if we could get ice cream. We got ice cream. If you're starting to feel the weight of everything Nora carried quietly for 4 years, imagine finally setting it down. That's exactly what's coming. Drop a single word in the comments right now if you've ever been someone's invisible safety net. I want to see how many of you recognize this story. While I was buying ice cream that day, Renee was busy building an entirely different version of events. I'll give my sister-in-law this much credit. She's never held a steady job in her life, but she could run a press office. The family group chat, 40-some relatives on both sides, received a version of Christmas where I had ambushed a grieving widow with wild accusations about money and stormed out afterward, trying to punish her financially out of spite. The slap never appeared in that version. My name did, always attached to the phrase, "after everything that was done for her." Word spread quietly through the church group. The school pickup line heard we'd simply had a falling out, delivered with the kind of eyebrow raise that says everything a sentence can't. An aunt who I had hosted for 8 straight Thanksgivings called to tell me, gently, that family forgives, and that pride only punishes the proud. I thanked her for calling and didn't explain a thing. That was the policy I'd set for myself back in December, and it cost me more than any amount of money ever had. If anyone asked me directly, they got exactly one sentence. "Patricia hit me in front of my daughter, and I stopped paying her bills." Both true. Both things I could live with. Nothing more, no matter how loudly the silence begged me to defend myself. I lost my church friends over it. I lost 2 school mom friendships I had genuinely believed were real. On the nights it stung the most, I stood in Maddie's doorway and watched her sleep and did the only math that still mattered. One witness, 8 years old, quietly learning exactly what her mother does when an entire room decides the truth is inconvenient. In March, the part of this story Renee's version never had a chapter for finally surfaced. A bank letter, forwarded to Daniel by a panicking Patricia, revealed that the mortgage on that colonial house had already been 60 days delinquent twice before Christmas, while my automatic payments were still actively running. The math didn't make sense until suddenly it did. My $850 had never fully reached the bank at all. It had gone into an account already stretched thin by taxes, by a lifestyle that no widow's pension could ever sustain, by Renee's boutique money sitting right alongside it. My money hadn't been holding up that house. It had been holding up the performance of that house, and the performance had been running over budget for years. Meanwhile, Renee, several $100s behind on a lease she genuinely couldn't cover without my help, quietly turned in her car and posted online about simplifying her life. I felt no satisfaction reading any of it. I need you to understand that clearly, because this is the part where a revenge story usually gets it wrong. Watching a 63-year-old woman's finances quietly collapse brings no joy at all, even after she struck you, even when every falling number is exactly the number you predicted. What I actually felt was the same cold, clean confirmation a nurse feels when a scan finally proves something she'd already suspected for months. I hadn't caused any of this. I had simply been the one covering it up. The months that followed were quiet, the way a house is quiet right before it finally settles. Spring passed. Summer passed. Then, the week before Thanksgiving, Daniel looked up from his phone one evening and said, "She wants to see you." But before that invitation, there was one more fight, the one 9 months in the making. It happened in our kitchen early November while Maddie was at a sleepover. Daniel sat his phone down and said he needed to ask me something and needed me not to explode. I told him I had never once exploded in this whole ordeal, and we both knew that was true, which somehow made it worse. "The refinance needs a second income on the application," he said. "Mom's asking, I'm asking. She's 63, Nora, it's one signature, and this whole year finally calms down. She's my mother. Can't you just bend just this once?" And there it was at last, spoken plainly in my own kitchen. Not a defense of the slap, nobody would ever try defending that. The slap had simply been erased from the record entirely. Just bend, just sign, just resume. I looked at this man I had loved since I was 26, and for the first time I saw the entire machine of him clearly. A boy raised at that same table under that same seating chart, taught his whole life that peace was something women were supposed to manufacture for his mother, the way a kitchen produces dinner. He wasn't cruel. He was afraid, and he had been afraid for so long that he'd learned to call it being reasonable. "I'm not signing," I said quietly. "And I'm only going to say this once, so please hear all of it. For years I bent so this family never had to. I bent through every Christmas, every group chat, every single toast. The bending is finished. I will go to counseling with you tonight if you want, because I want this marriage. But I will not co-sign the stage set. And if you make me choose between being your wife and being her funding source, understand clearly that you are the one making me choose." He didn't answer right away. But he looked at me that time, not at his plate, and I will love him a little longer for that one small motion than he will ever fully know. The person who finally handed me the missing piece of Patricia was Daniel's great-aunt Lorraine, 81 years old, the only person in that entire family who had ever once asked me a real question about myself and stayed to hear the answer. She invited me for tea in her overheated apartment and got straight to the point, the way only the very old are allowed to. "They're telling this whole thing wrong," she said, pouring. "I was there at Christmas. I saw exactly where that hand came from." Then she told me where it came from, not the arm, the decades. Patricia's own family had run that laundromat for years. She'd worked there all through school, studying the wealthier families the way other students studied textbooks, learning exactly how they set a table, how they wrote a proper thank you note, how they spoke certain words a certain way. She married up, Lorraine said, without any malice in her voice, married a good man from a good street, and spent 40 years slowly sanding away every trace of that laundromat until even her own children had no idea it had ever existed. The china, the seating chart, the constant in this family declarations. "That's not old money, honey," Lorraine said. "T. Hat's a woman standing guard at a border. Old money never checks anyone's papers. It doesn't have to." She looked at me with those sharp, pale eyes. "Your mother-in-law has spent her whole life running from a trailer park of her own. And you just happen to look exactly like the road back." I drove home that night finally understanding that I had spent 4 years being slapped by a mirror. It didn't excuse a single thing Patricia had done. Understanding never does. But it told me exactly what I was going to be sitting across from at the dinner she was now asking for. The invitation itself came directly from Patricia, the first message she'd sent me since that Christmas morning that didn't mention a mortgage payment. "Nora, this year has hurt all of us, and I've had time to think. I'd like the family to sit down together before the holidays. Antonio's, Saturday at 7. There are things I need to say to you properly." I texted back within the hour with 2 conditions. Daniel had to be there, and whatever got said stayed at that table, no group chat before or after. A thumbs up came back instantly, which told me she'd been staring at her phone the entire time. The night before that dinner, Daniel told me something I had never heard in 4 years of marriage. Lying in the dark, he said, "I was 9 years old playing Little League. Struck out with the bases loaded and cried on the bench. Mom drove me home in total silence, and when we pulled into the driveway, she said, in this family, we don't embarrass ourselves in public. Do you understand me? I'm 37 now, Nora, and I have been 9 years old at that table my entire life." You know what I actually felt the moment she slapped you? Relief. For one full second, because for once it wasn't me being corrected. And then I saw Maddie's face, and I felt sick about that 1 second every single day since. That confession didn't fix 4 years overnight, but it told me exactly who would be sitting beside me at that dinner. A man in the middle of the longest walk of his life, moving from his mother's side toward mine as fast as his fear would allow. Saturday came quickly. White tablecloths, low lighting, other families having easier evenings around us. Patricia was already seated when we arrived, in her best silk, pearls on, and beside her chair sat a blue folder, squared perfectly to the table's edge like it had been given its own seat at dinner. We ordered. We made the careful small talk of families in crisis. Then Patricia set down her fork, touched her napkin to her lips, and did something I no longer believed she was capable of. "Nora, what I did at Christmas was wrong. Not the argument. My hand. I struck you in front of your child in my own home, and I have heard the sound of it every single day since. I am asking you to forgive me." The table went completely still, and I want to be honest about what happened in my chest, because this is the part where I was the one truly being tested. It worked for a moment. 4 years of quiet wanting rose up like water pressing against a door. My eyes actually stung. Then Patricia reached beside her chair, lifted that blue folder, and slid it across the white tablecloth with 2 fingers, gentle as dealing a card she'd been holding all night. "Which is why," she said, "I wanted us to talk about the house as a family." Inside sat a refinance application, little arrow stickers marking every place a signature belonged. My income, not Daniel's, already penciled into the worksheet. Beneath it, a typed page in Renee's careful font, laying out a plan where the automatic payments simply resumed, quietly, until Mom is stabilized. I looked at Patricia's trembling hand resting on the folder's edge, and she said, so quietly the whole table nearly missed it, "I cannot go back to being nobody, Nora. You don't know what that's like." "I do, actually," I said just as quietly. "I grew up there." For one long second, the border guard and the girl from the laundromat were both sitting in that chair, and neither one of them could speak. That was the closest Patricia and I have ever come to each other. It changed absolutely nothing about what happened next. I reached out and closed the folder. "No," I said, gently, completely. Then I lifted a manila envelope from my bag and set it where the folder had been. Inside was the number for a nonprofit financial counseling office that specializes in seniors. contact information for 2 realtors who help older homeowners downsize with dignity, and a printout on a state property tax relief program Patricia almost certainly qualified for but had been too proud to ever look up. "This is what I'm still willing to give," I said. "Help finding the way forward, everything except the wallet. I spent 4 years and over $60,000 renting a seat at this family's table, and the rent bought me the far end of the table and a slap in front of my daughter. That's closed now. It stays closed." Patricia's chin lifted, the border guard reassembling itself in real time. "You would put me out of my own house. You, of all people." "You're right that I'm from a trailer park," I said. "That's exactly why I know the difference between a home and a stage set. I grew up in a home." What happened next, 18 relatives would have paid good money to witness and still wouldn't fully believe. Patricia Whitcomb, the woman who spent 40 years insisting her family never made scenes, stood up in the middle of that restaurant and made one. Voice cracking, napkin thrown to the table, calling me ungrateful in front of an entire dining room turning to stare. And Daniel, my husband, the boy from that little league bench, did not stand up with her. He stayed in his seat, placed his hand gently over mine, and said, "Mom, Nora's told you what's on the table. I think you should take the envelope." They left without it. 2 Christmases later, this is exactly where the story ends, and it fits inside one small kitchen. Christmas dinner at our house on Hollow Creek Road. Mismatched plates from 3 different thrift stores, every single one chosen on purpose by a 9-year-old who loves nothing matching. Paper stars hanging from the light fixture. Daniel actually cooking, apron and all, a full year of Tuesday counseling sessions showing in the steadiness of his hands. The colonial on the hills sold that following spring, enough in the end to clear the mortgage and fund a modest 2-bedroom apartment closer to Renee. Patricia still tells her new neighbors that her daughter-in-law tore this family apart. I've made peace with being that story in someone else's small, shrinking world. In December, a card arrived addressed to me alone, in Renee's handwriting, no return address, one single line where the printed greeting should have been. "The insurance thing. I get it now." Not an apology, not quite a bridge, just a small crack in a wall, which is exactly how every door in history has ever started. My own mother spent her whole life renting a seat in every room she ever entered, and every one of those rooms eventually forgot her. My daughter watched her mother get struck at a dinner table, and then she watched everything that came after. I own my seat now. One day, she will too. I used to believe love meant making yourself so useful that nobody could afford to lose you. I know now that anyone who prices your seat at their table was never actually offering you a home. And the most loving word a tired woman can ever learn to say, calmly, completely, without a single explanation attached, is simply no. If you've ever been someone's invisible safety net, the reliable one who covers and never counts, let this be your sign to finally look at that bill. Share this with a woman who keeps the peace at her own expense. Drop a comment below, "I read every single one," and hit subscribe because there's always another story waiting.